The Denver Broncos have been facing a ton of scrutiny this offseason, with many NFL fans, including myself, suggesting that the Denver Broncos might be one of, if not the worst team in the league in 2024. However, in today's video, I want to shed a little bit of light on the Denver Broncos and talk about why they may or may not be a tad bit underrated this upcoming season. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the Denver Broncos, and by doing so, I'm going to break it down into 3 different segments. We're going to start off by talking about why the Denver Broncos are an underrated team, and then I'll discuss why the Denver Broncos might not be underrated. And then at the very end of the video, I'll give you guys my opinion about whether or not the Denver Broncos are an underrated team. Now, before I get into the video, if you do enjoy NFL content, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button. Hopefully you guys will enjoy the channel, but let's get into the video. Alright, so as I mentioned, we're going to start off by talking about why the Denver Broncos might actually be a little bit underrated. And let's start off by talking about their roster, because I think in general, the roster is actually pretty decent next year, and I think it's a tad bit underrated. Now, I don't necessarily think that this roster has the star power to match up with other NFL teams, but I think when it comes down to it, just overall, the roster is actually pretty solid. We'll start off with the offense, which I think is probably the weaker unit in comparison to the defense, but I think offensively speaking, you do have some talented players like Javonte Williams, Courtland Sutton. I'm a pretty big fan of Josh Reynolds, and I actually think they have some pretty young and talented receivers with guys like Marvin Mims and Troy Franklin. I'm actually pretty excited to see what those guys can do. I'm more expecting Marvin Mims to have a bigger role in this offense, whereas for Troy Franklin, I think it's going to be more of a developmental type of season this upcoming one. So at least we'll have some pretty interesting wide receivers to be watching this upcoming season. Then of course, we can't talk about the Denver Broncos without talking about their quarterback situation. I'll talk about Bo Nix a little bit later in the video, but for now, I do think the trio of Jarrett Stidham, Bo Nix, and Zach Wilson is a pretty underwhelming quarterback core, but if Bo Nix or Zach Wilson can develop into being a full-time starter, I think there's some pretty decent upside. When it comes to Jarrett Stidham though, who I do expect to probably play at least a couple snaps this upcoming season, I think he's a pretty solid quarterback. Everywhere he's gone, he's basically been pretty decent, so I expect him to be at least a serviceable starting quarterback if needed, and at least a very good mentor for a guy like Bo. But I think the highlight of this offense is going to be within the offensive line. Now, unfortunately, they did lose their starting center in free agency, but I do think the rest of the offensive line is pretty solid, and I am excited to see what Sam Mustipher at the center position can do this upcoming one. At left tackle, you have Garrett Bowles, who I think is one of the better left tackles in the league. Then you have Ben Powers at left guard, Quinn Miners at right guard, and then Mike McGlinchey at right tackle. I think your tackles are more of the highlight of this offensive line, with Quinn being one of the better right guards in the league. And I think in general, this is a pretty decent offensive line. Is it a top 10 offensive line unit in the league? Probably not, but when it comes down to like maybe top 15, you could definitely make a case they are. Defensively speaking is really where I think this team shines a tad bit brighter, because you have a number of really good pass rushers with guys like Zach Allen, John Franklin Myers, Jonathan Cooper, Baron Browning, and Nick Bonito. I think all of those guys are pretty solid pass rushers, not to mention you do have another guy in Jonah Ellis who's going to develop behind Jonathan Cooper. And while none of those guys are 10 sack per season type of dudes, I do think that there is some players on this list who I think could maybe develop into being pretty decent and serviceable pass rushers. This is a defense where if you're just sending 4 consistently, you're probably not going to get enough pressure on the quarterback, because there isn't a Micah or Parsons or a Nick Bosa type of guy on this team. But this is a team where they know how to fit their pass rush lanes quite nicely, and if you do send some blitz, they're really going to get to the quarterback at a very high level. Last year, this defense really took a big step forward once they started to pressure the quarterback by sending some really exotic blitzes, so I do expect that to sort of be their calling card in 2024. I think their linebackers with Alex Singleton, Cody Barton, and some of the other dudes on this team are pretty solid. I'm actually quite interested to see what Drew Sanders can do this upcoming one. I know he was a pretty highly touted linebacker coming out of college, but didn't really play too much last year, so I'm intrigued to see what he can do. But typically the Denver Broncos get a lot out of their linebackers, so Alex Singleton and Cody Barton are probably in for some pretty solid seasons this upcoming one. Then your secondary I think is actually pretty solid. You have your Texas safety combination of Caden Stearns and Brandon Jones, who I think are actually a little bit underrated. Not to mention you do have PJ Locke behind Caden Stearns, who maybe could be a starter at some point this upcoming season. Then your cornerback trio of Jaquan McMillan at nickelback, Pat Surtain, and then of course Levi Wallace, I think is a pretty solid unit all in all. I do think that Levi Wallace is a little bit of a weaker cornerback too at this stage of his career, but I'm definitely not going to hate on it. I'm extremely excited to see what he could do next to Pat Surtain. And then Jaquan McMillan actually had a really surprising year last year. He was a lot better this past season, and I do think he's going to be in for an even bigger season this upcoming one. He's been in the league for a couple years now, and I think that last year was really kind of his breakout season, so I'm intrigued to see what he can do in 2024, and if he can take a step forward from what he did last year. So all in all, I think I'm actually pretty excited about what this secondary can turn into, especially with the amount of blitzes they're going to send. There's going to be a lot of pressure for this defense to create some turnovers. So all in all, the talent on this roster isn't necessarily bad. Like, I think when we talk about this Denver Broncos team, I think we typically just sort of ignore the talented players on this roster. I think the big point of contention about why this team is not really praised that often by national media is because they don't have a Patrick Mahomes as their starting quarterback. But I think that's a little bit unfair to the rest of the roster because I think in general, it's a pretty solid roster all around. The next reason why I think this team might be a little bit underrated is because I actually think that Sean Payton is a very good head coach. Now, I know he's been a little bit controversial the past couple of seasons with some of the things he said and done, especially surrounding Russell Wilson. But I'll give him credit. I thought last year this team did a really good job of bouncing back, especially after that embarrassing Miami Dolphins game. If you actually kind of break down the Broncos season from the first half of the season where they got obliterated by the Dolphins and had a really slow start to around the halfway point and even honestly just after the Miami Dolphins game, those were like two completely different teams. And if they actually just played pretty decent in the first half of the season, they easily probably could have won like 10 games last year. So I think a lot of NFL fans are going to talk about the Denver Broncos and how they actually suck, when in reality, they were actually a pretty decent team last year, and had they just played up to standard the entire season, they probably could have made the playoffs in some ways. And I think a big reason for that is because of Sean Payton and what he's been able to do with his offenses, but also just keeping his troops rallied around him. The last thing I'll talk about is going to be their schedule, which is not necessarily a extremely hard schedule. I wouldn't say it's necessarily easy because you do have some tough matchups against the likes of like Baltimore, Kansas City, Cleveland, and the Jets. But in comparison to a lot of other schedules that I've seen out there, this is definitely not a tough schedule. You open the season off with the Seattle Seahawks, which I don't expect them to win, but it definitely could be a closer game than some might expect. Then in week 2, you got Pittsburgh, another kind of tough game, kind of similar to Seattle in some ways. Then you got Tampa Bay, the Jets, the Raiders, the Chargers, the Saints, and the Panthers. I think in that 5 or 4 game stretch that I just talked about there, you could easily see this team probably winning 2 or 3 of those matchups. Then you have the tough games of like the Baltimore, the Chiefs, the Falcons. I don't think they'll win any of those ones, but then you end week 12 and week 13 with the Raiders and Browns before your bye week. I do think up to the bye week, you've played 13 games. If you could be somewhere along the lines of like 5-8, I think that's a pretty solid start to your season. Because unfortunately, after the bye week, you do have 4 kind of tough games. You have the Colts, the Chargers, the Bengals, and the Chiefs. I don't really know how many games they'll win there, but if they can win like 2 of those games, that'd be pretty impressive. So all in all, the Denver Broncos don't have an extremely tough schedule, which I do think kind of does point to them potentially being a tad bit underrated, especially when you hear people say that this team is not going to win a single game next year, which is a completely ridiculous take. Alright, so we talked about why they might be an underrated team, but let's talk about the opposite, why the Denver Broncos might not be an underrated team. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about why the Denver Broncos are not an underrated team, and we're going to start off by talking about Bo Nix and why he may or may not be the starting quarterback of this team moving forward. Now, I'll say this, I was a relatively decent fan of Bo Nix. I thought Bo Nix received a lot of unfair criticisms coming out of college. But I will say I did not have him as a top 30 prospect heading into the draft. I thought there was a lot of really good players, and I thought that Bo Nix was just really not up to the standard that I would have liked to have seen, especially from the number 12 overall pick. Now, that being said, I don't necessarily blame the Broncos for taking him when they did, because they didn't have a starting quarterback, to be honest with you, and, well, quarterbacks were flying off the board really fast, and Bo Nix probably would have been taken off the board if they tried to trade in towards the back end of the first or early second. He probably would not have been available. So I think taking Bo Nix when you took him was decent value, all things considered, and I actually think that Bo Nix can actually be a pretty solid starting quarterback this upcoming season. I think of all the quarterbacks that we're taking in this year's draft, if you take out maybe like Caleb Williams and maybe Michael Penix Jr., Bo Nix is the most pro-ready quarterback of all of them, and that comes with a couple of different factors. Number one, his age. He's been in the college football system for quite some time. Now he's heading into the NFL where he's already kind of an older rookie prospect. So there should be some expectations from him to be able to play basically immediately. Then you also have the fact that he pretty nicely fits the Sean Payton system. This is a quarterback who's going to go through his progressions quite nicely. He's going to find the open player, not going to make a whole bunch of mistakes, but is able to do exactly what the system needs him to do. And the nice thing about Bo Nix is that he did play behind that Auburn offensive line for quite so many years, so if he does need to make some plays with his legs, he's definitely capable of doing so. I think Bo Nix has sort of gotten this bad rap from a lot of college football fans as sort of just being this guy who checks it down a bunch and just throws a bunch of screens, when that's really not completely true. Like, yes, he definitely did do that, but there was also a lot of NFL stuff that he also had to do. So no, I don't expect Bo Nix to be the best quarterback of this draft class, but I do expect him to be pretty solid in year one behind this system. With that being said though, he is a rookie quarterback and the expectations on him shouldn't be that high, and I don't expect him to carry an overall average roster to being a really good team. Which brings us to our next point, which has to do with the overall roster. This is just a roster that just sort of lacks star power. I think if you take this roster and maybe add like 2 or 3 more like superstar level players, this is a genuinely great team. But the problem is this team doesn't have that many superstars. Right now, as of today, I think there's really only like one true superstar on this roster, which is going to be Patrick Surtain, of course, your best cornerback arguably in the league. But outside of that, you have some other players like Garrett Bowles and Mike McGlinchey and Cortland Sutton, who are great players, but not necessarily like superstar level guys. And so I do think that does sort of pose a problem for the Denver Broncos in their future, because they don't have the star power to maybe elevate the roster a tad bit more. But again, because this is kind of technically year one of your official kind of quote-unquote rebuild slash retooling phase, I don't really think this roster is all that bad for a year one retooling phase. You have a lot of really solid players, and yes, you lack the star power, but you're hopeful that in the upcoming drafts and some free agencies, you'll be able to bring in some superstars to kind of help elevate this team. But I do think for this upcoming season, it does hurt you that you don't have that many top 10 NFL players at their respective positions. It's a good team, just not a great team, and I think a big reason why they don't have superstars. And I think a big reason why Bo Nix might struggle in year one is because of the lack of superstars within the weapons on this team. As I mentioned earlier, you have Javonte Williams, Cortland Sutton, Josh Reynolds, Marvin Mims, and your tight end is going to be either Greg Dulcich or Adam Troutman. And just of those names, the best player of those guys is going to be Cortland Sutton, but Cortland Sutton isn't a superstar, and I don't think that any of the other players I listed are really even close to being stars, which could pose a problem for a guy like Bo Nix, who probably would like to have some superstars to help him in year one. Of course, you moved off of Jerry Jeudy, which I thought was the right move because he wasn't going to be a superstar for this team, but it does suck that he wasn't able to develop into being that superstar guy, because he would definitely help a young guy like Bo Nix. The next thing I'll talk about, and it'll be the last thing I talk about before I give you guys my opinion, is that I'm not quite yet sold on Joe Lombardi, their offensive coordinator. Yes, I will say that Joe Lombardi has a pretty historic career with what he was able to do with the Saints for many years. Coaching staff positions for many different teams, but everywhere he's gone as the offensive coordinator, I don't really think he's done that much to necessarily impress. He was the offensive coordinator for the Detroit Lions in 2014, which I don't think he did that great of a job then. And then the past couple years, he's been serving as the LA Chargers offensive coordinator. And while he had some success, I think a big reason why the Chargers didn't really have the success they should have had was because of their offensive coordinator in Joe Lombardi. And now he's the Denver Broncos offensive coordinator. And while I do think that he's going to be a decent coach there, I do have some question marks about whether or not he's going to be that great. Now, I will say this, he's not going to be calling every single play. That's going to be Sean Payton. He's really their offensive coordinator, but in some ways, I don't really love the Joe Lombardi hire. I would have liked to prefer them to go out there and get a younger, more prospective and talented coach who can maybe grow into being their future head coach or a future head coach at another team. All right, so I gave you guys both sides of the spectrum here, why this team might be underrated, why they may not be underrated. But what is my opinion? Well, my opinion is this. I think the Denver Broncos, in all regards, have been an extremely underrated team just based off everything that I've been hearing. The national media, and even sometimes myself, will tell you that the Denver Broncos are one of the worst teams in the league, which I think is a little bit unfair in comparison to what they actually are. And while I don't think this Denver Broncos team is going to be really making some serious noise in playoff contention or even coming close to making the playoffs, I definitely think they're closer to making the playoffs than they are closer to being the worst team in the NFL. Are they the best team in the league? Are they the best team in their division? No, not even close, but they're definitely not the worst team in the NFL, and they'll definitely win more than like 3 or 4 games next year. And some of you guys might be a little bit confused why my opinion on this team has changed, because throughout the offseason, I've talked quite negatively about this Broncos team and why they are probably going to be one of the worser teams out there. But after doing a bunch of research and just kind of listening to Broncos fans, I think most Broncos fans will tell you that they're actually not that bad of a team, which they actually quite literally aren't. They're not a good team, but as long as you're thinking that they're going to win somewhere between like 6 to 9 games next year, they're perfectly rated fine. So they are an underrated team in my opinion, but I think they have a lot of work to do still. But if you enjoyed the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.